to another edition of Engagement That Scales. We took a little break for the summer. We are back and we are refreshed. Hi, Rachel.
Hi.
Hi, Scott.
Hello.
We are very excited to be back. Rachel, take it away.
Thank you, Shannon. Scott, thank you so much for joining me. We haven't caught up in forever.
Yeah.
It's been a while. I don't even want to think about it. Our daughters are both like older than, well, they exist.
Yes.
In the world. So how are you?
I am well. It's good to see you and good to be here. And I'm thrilled to be part of the fall lineup here.
Well, I'm using this as an excuse and an opportunity to have fun, interesting conversations and hear what people are up to. So in that vein, I would love to hear what you've been up to lately, who you've been, not who you've been working with, but the projects you've been working on, and kind of like what's capturing your attention these days.
Sure. Well, I've been sheltering in place for like everybody. It's interesting because I left Ford in my role there as global head of digital communications and social media 6 years ago now. And I've been out on my own since then. And, you know, I've been working from home for 6 years. So what's all happened isn't really too much of a disruption other than the complete obliteration of travel and of speaking.
Mm-hmm.
So there's been a little adjustment there, but I'm still working with clients and still
Are the kids at home? Is that different? Are your kids at home?
Well, it's interesting. They were at home starting in March. We're in Michigan. So we have a governor who took things very seriously, locked us down. And kids were home for the second half of the spring semester. Now they're back in school, and the two boys who are a freshman and junior in high school, their school gave the option to, you know, whether you want to go at home or go back to school physically. And they are both gregarious creatures. And the freshman especially, he didn't want to miss out on the experience of what high school was all about. So they're actually in school. And our first grader, who is 6, we decided to do homeschooling with her. So not even doing the school curriculum, just kind of doing it on our own. And that's actually working out really well. And she's out on a field trip this morning. So
nice.
It'll be a little quieter around here as a result.
Yeah, I have this. My daughter was home all spring and is now back in school. And so the weird thing for me is I had coworkers and kids, and I was like, get out of my office. I mean, like, home is my office. Go. So it's a little nice to have the routine back of like not having to switch my attention back and forth. I can work. I still have a coworker, but he seems to be relatively well behaved.
Yes.
So that has been a relief to just get a little more normalcy back.
That's good.
But yeah, I'm like you. I've worked at home for the last 10 years. Like the digital work is not interesting, but I think you and I have chatted a little online. Like I'm working with this college now, and it's like going back 3 decades.
Right.
And I'm like, what is going on here? Like you are unprepared.
You know, that is not uncommon. And I'm seeing this in a lot of instances where it feels like we're saying the same things that we said 10 years ago. Mm-hmm. I think it's for a few reasons. One, there's no institutional memory. You know, people move from job to job, from company to company, spending, you know, maybe 3 to 5 years, if you're lucky, in one position. So there's no, you think about the oral history of a company and how much is handed down as part of the culture, and it's storytelling internally, right? And it's somebody telling you about a time they were in a meeting, or a time they tried a campaign, or a time they tried this or that with a certain executive. That's being obliterated more now more than ever because of this transiency that we see in people, and that's fine. I mean, that happens.
What's interesting when you say that, it's the executive ranks more than anything that's that transient. The rest of the organization isn't, and so where you're losing that knowledge and history is or how you organize.
That's exactly right, and every executive that comes in is going to have his or her own viewpoint as to how something should be done. And it doesn't necessarily mean there's going to be continuity within the process. And it feels like, in many cases, particularly with CMOs, where their tenure is now, I think, around 18 months, that they're coming in and they're just blowing apart the agency relationship. They're bringing in their own people. They're putting a strategy together. And then they're not being given the time to execute on that strategy. And 18 months later, lather, rinse, and repeat. And it's just
it's funny you say that, because we worked with a very large Fortune 500 company over a decade. And I had 3 different heads of communication through that time. And the interesting thing to me is they were trying to build internal trust with the employees. The people they kept hiring had the same approach as the last one, only with new priorities in terms of communication content. And so the employees were like, well, why should I believe this regime? Because it's just going to change in another 2 years, and like, whatever. And so they were working on a community strategy, but we stopped working with them when the new regime came in and was like, these people are not ready to engage. And I was like, you're talking about your coworkers.
Seriously. I mean, and it's not all that uncommon. And part of it stems from whether it's communications or marketing, kind of wanting to build its own thing, its own fiefdom, its own house. Whereas the business itself should be slow and steady ahead, right? Mm-hmm. And if you have a plan, it's a matter of sticking to that plan and communicating the plan. And if what you're trying to create with a community falls under that umbrella, then it shouldn't be a problem. But if it feels like you're constantly going off into left and right turns and trying something new and stopping and starting, then there's going to be unease, there's going to be distrust, and there's going to ultimately be some kind of malaise that settles over your employee base, because they'd rather not get engaged if it's going to mean constant, plowing ahead, 1 step forward, 2 steps back kind of a thing.
Well, that brings up an interesting question, and actually what I wanted to kind of get into with you, which is the way we think about communications historically, and it's been very tightly linked to strategy and business planning and leadership, which it should be. But for the last 100 years, we've been in relatively stable markets, in that you can go out to the market, you can do a lot of research, you can figure out how they live, how they work, what they need, go back and spend 2 to 5 years building it. And by the time you bring it to the market, it will still be relevant. And now we're in a communications environment where like crises are popping up that like we've gone from this stability to this volatility. And the traditional way we think about strategy and planning is just too heavy, because by the time we're done with it, it's irrelevant. So what's your perspective of how that adapts in this environment?
Well, I mean, this kind of gets to what I like to focus on professionally and in my counseling with clients and in my writing. I write a newsletter called Timeless and Timely. And what it's meant to do is to capture stories, because what is history but a set of stories? And the way, I've got kids who don't necessarily enjoy history in school. And there were some history courses that I didn't enjoy when I was in school. But the difference is it comes down to who's telling the story. Do you have a good teacher who is making it not just a set of facts and dates and names to memorize, but have they crafted a story, right? And that's what history is. It's a set of stories. Just like I was telling you earlier, that we're lacking that oral history, that handing down from one generation to the next within the company of those corporate culture stories. So to me, looking at history, looking at philosophy, looking at literature for examples that have come before that we can learn from, things that speak to the universal nature of some of our behaviors, because we are always going to be faced with new technologies and new platforms, and things are going to happen faster than ever. But if you can get your head around the fundamentals, and if you can learn from the mistakes that others have made in the past, and they're not necessarily, the exact mistakes or the exact situation in which you find yourself, but they are applicable enough to be able to say, all right, here's what I need to focus on long term, and here's what I need to tweak along the way. So helping people kind of think both in the past as well as in the future is what I think helps us get out of that situation.
Yeah, and I found a lot of similar things in my work, which is, we're always talking about shared purpose and shared value, meaning where's the intersection of like what you care about and what your audience cares about, whether the audience is employees or customers or whatever, like where's that nugget?
Right.
And when we go in and look, even community strategies, people tend to forget the other person and or treat the other like they're delivering something to the other rather than sitting on the same side of the table and addressing the same problem. And so often I feel like our organizations are trying to perfect things for the audience and throw it over the wall and then not have to talk to them because we've perfected it.
Yeah, a perfect example of that. I was just commenting on this last night and this morning on Twitter. The J.M. Smucker Company, famous for Smucker's Jam, right? Well, they also own Dunkin' brands. They own Folgers. They own Meow Mix, Crisco, Jif, right? It's a house of brands. They just had a redesign of their logo. Now, their classic logo is so recognizable. It's that old style, that old-timey font that says Smuckers, and it has the strawberries there. And I get why they would want to move away from just strawberries as their logo, and as they're focusing more on J.M. Smucker Company rather than just the Smucker's Jam brand. But they came up with a logo that looks like some kind of nouveau riche art installation of guitar picks that takes like 5 paragraphs of explanation to get the point across. And I thought to myself, how did these people arrive at this? Like they got so high on their own supply, basically. They're drinking their own Kool-Aid, and they're going back and forth, and they've got a narrative that makes sense to them because they're so close to it. But I wondered, did you test this out? Did you take it out to the public and get their reaction? Did you actually see what the other person might think of it? The people that you're actually trying to reach. And it just stood out as a perfect example, a literal visual example of everything that's wrong with branding.
I want Smuckers because it's comforting.
Right.
Because it's new. Like, I saw that too when you shared it. And it struck me as a logo of something that's ephemeral, like software or knowledge, or like something that's not, like doesn't have that physical piece. And I'm like, you actually have something physical that you could put in your logo, and you've made it abstract.
Exactly. It seems to me like they're trying to become, like Procter & Gamble, P&G, which has been a house of brands for years. But you don't focus on the P&G logo itself. They really focus it on the brand level. So for Smuckers to actually have a brand logo that's reminiscent of its jelly to begin with, and then doesn't really even make sense, it's like, why?
Yeah. It is, I'm not sure I have more to say about that really. But I've had the same conversation of people, well, I've worked in software companies where we've gotten a new CEO MO when they changed the logo. And I'm always like, why?
Right.
We have a kind of quirky logo ourselves at the CR, which has a backstory that a lot of people don't understand. And I've had people come to me and be like, it does not look modern. And you are modern. You're like talking. And I'm like, well, community is not really modern. I mean, some of the tools we're using to build community are, but like, it's not really a modern concept.
Right.
And they try and convince me I should change the logo. And I'm like, do you know how small our team is? Do you know how much content we have? Do you know how forget the logo itself. And do you know how recognizable that is? Maybe people don't understand it, but they see it and they know what it is.
Exactly right.
So maybe we'll screw around with the logo like a little bit, but like, we're not going to change it. At least not while we have better things to do.
Well, see, this is why I go with the bow tie. It's never out of style because it's never in style.
You sound like you are a good Yankee in that respect.
I am. Born and bred in New England. Stayed on Boston after I went to college there for 20 years before I came out here to Ford.
My husband started a blog called Yankee 2.0.
Nice. I got to check that out.
He never actually, he had all these grand plans to do something with it. He's more in communications than the engagement side.
I remember going to my grandparents' house where, Saturday night was always Franks and beans and brown bread, and Yankee magazine would be on the back of the toilet. I mean, that was just life in New England.
Enduring things endure.
Exactly.
Turns out. Let's switch gears a little bit, because I had this kind of aha moment around structuring communications, meaning not the actual content of the communication, but how I think communications, because we used to have the time to plan, you could silo communications and then share it downstream. Now, because of the responsiveness rate that everybody needs and how quickly the news cycle goes, what I'm observing in some more traditional companies is stakeholders still want to sit behind closed doors, make a decision, flesh it out, and then get back to you. And by the time you get back to you, there's enough, the cycle is just so slow. It's not keeping up.
Yeah.
So how do you think about where does communications belong in an organization now? Because everybody needs it in a way that they didn't before.
Yeah. Well, if you think of a business, an organization, like the human body, the CEO, the C-suite, kind of sits at the head. They're the brain. Marketing, I think, would come towards part of the heart, at least if they're doing it well, where there's the emotion. Plus, it's part of what pumps the lifeblood throughout the organization. To me, communications is the nerve center of the company. And this is the way we treated it at Ford. It was closely aligned with the brain. Obviously it touched the heart, but it didn't report to the heart, right? It was part of the spinal column, and it reached to all areas of the body. I'm sorry?
How did you do that? Practically speaking.
So there was kind of a shared acknowledgement that if communications didn't know about it, it wasn't happening. We were a centralized group with satellites that were kind of out in, along the limbs and the fingertips. So every executive at a certain level had a communications counterpart that they were matched with, right? Okay. So that closed door discussion could still happen, but a communications person who was back in touch with the brain center, with the central command, had that rapid response, had the ability to counsel them, and had the wherewithal to say what was going to fly and what was not. So having kind of removing ourselves from being solely centrally located and having those disparate factions out there really helped. The other thing is there was a process by which we all met once a week and we were all on the same page as to what was happening. So everyone was well informed. And this was not only within all of the business units, but geographically all around the world.
Mhm.
And we had a document that ranged from 20 to 40 pages every week that was called Issues and Answers. And we anticipated what was going on outside in the marketplace, both in our industry and in the broader world, of things that we might have to answer to. And we had an answer for every single one of them. And that was distributed to this group all around the world. So you didn't have to go up the chain of command and say, well, what's our response on XYZ? You had a little bit of autonomy with consistency in messaging to be able to take care of that. And it worked really, really well.
That's, it reminds me of the military concept, shared situational awareness, of like, how do you give autonomy to the edges while you coordinate centrally?
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting to me thinking of the community lens on that, which is one of the values of having a community is you can see all of those issues very quickly so that you can figure out where they fit in the narrative, or if they fit in the narrative, or if you're even going to respond to them. And a lot of the times community sits in communications. But one of the challenges that I've seen in a lot of organizations, and this is, I'd also be interested in your perspective on this, is community teams are starved of staff. And we've been fighting this battle for a while. And then I realized, oh, it's not the community teams that are starved of staff. It's communications teams that are starved of staff. And so there's no extra staff to give to the community because there's no extra staff for communications. So do we need to invest more to get that system up in place?
Yeah, I think we absolutely do. I mean, if especially today, when you can only scale your team or your business so far, a community can take you that extra mile. And if you're not making that an important part of your strategy of your tactical team, then you're shooting yourself in the foot. I mean, look, when any crisis comes up, you are beholden to respond basically at the speed of Twitter. And we had a number of instances where we had to go to the mats on Twitter with people when I was at Ford. Now, fortunately, this was the early days when you could still get ahead of some stuff and have the scale yourself. Now, if you're trying to do that without paid media, without a regular presence there to begin with, and without a community which is built from having that regular presence, then you may as well just give up and sock it in.
Yeah. I mean, you can't be everywhere at all places responding to everything. And actually what we find is centralized voices aren't as trusted in, we could bring up all the issues that are going on in communications right now between disinformation and overwhelm and the toxic rage going on. There are places you don't want to interject a formal brand voice because it doesn't serve you to give oxygen to certain conversations.
That's right. And even if you do, you think about the Edelman Trust Barometer that's been around for 2 decades. Consistently, year after year, it comes back to who do people trust the most? People like them, right? If you're within a company and you haven't established that regular relationship with people, then you may as well not show up, to your point. You may actually do more damage by seeming disingenuous or just like the PR hack that's there, than you would by handing off to your community, right? Having somebody that's working alongside you in that case, or like I said, being a regular member of the community from the get-go, which is what I did when I was at Ford.
Yeah.
I was given a lot of latitude and a lot of credibility because I knew these platforms. I knew a lot of people I was talking to, and they knew me.
Yeah.
I put my own reputation on the line to stand up for Ford's reputation. And it worked really well, particularly because the company itself had a heritage of being associated with a person.
Yeah.
Henry Ford, like him or not, he was associated with the company for the first 40 years of its establishment. And guess what? His name is still on the logo today. And that the family owns the company. So to be able to take that very human approach, it worked consistently and strategically for what Ford was trying to accomplish.
I see so much transactional communications going on that throw it over your fence, especially difficult topics. People don't actually want to respond to the difficult topics. They want to kind of put a statement out there and then la 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 la. It's not happening. And I'm also struggling with that in the communications environment of people aren't willing to have hard conversations, which doesn't mean you have to have an answer to the challenges you're getting. But I feel like if you don't entertain them or acknowledge them, they're much more likely to blow up. I mean, I'm sure you've dealt with a ton of that, both at Ford and now with your clients.
Yeah, I think that they're not only likely to blow up, but people are likely to just ignore it entirely, and then you become irrelevant.
Yeah.
To me, the part of getting to understanding with people is to first try to understand them and understand where they're coming from. And putting out a statement feels like you're simply blocking that your fingers in your ears. That was the perfect metaphor for what's going on. It's like throwing something over the fence and just running away. And that doesn't build relationships. And relationships are ultimately what lead to trust.
Yeah.
And trust leads to loyalty, which is what you want in your customer base. So more broadly, when you're thinking about reputation, it's okay to have these tough discussions, because here's the thing. People aren't predisposed to heavy thinking these days. We live in a TikTok society where you're lucky if you get 60 seconds with someone and it's all about fluff. To have a hard conversation and to realize and acknowledge that there are very few absolutes in situations. And you may come armed with a whole bunch of facts, which are important, by the way, to kind of prove your credibility. But at the same time, if you don't acknowledge the way someone is feeling, a real experience that they may have gone through that has made them feel that way, then your facts don't amount to, as Humphrey Bogart would say, a hill of beans. So being willing to simply sit down and have these conversations and engage with people for more than a minute at a time, and to make it a back and forth thing, not a thing where you're just talking at people, I think is where we need to land.
And it's about integrity at the end of the day, right? It's like taking responsibility for the choices you make, because everybody has to make choices, and that choice always has a pro and con. And just acknowledging that you can't do everything, I've found, goes a long way. And being like, yeah, I realize that's an opportunity. We can't seize it right now.
Right. And look, if you're honest with people about that, at least they know.
Yeah.
You're strapped for resources, you're strapped for time, whatever it may be. Simply allowing them to feel like they've been heard goes about 90% of the way towards tackling this stuff, because the next time it happens, or perhaps if it happens to someone they know, now they can speak out on your behalf and say, hey, cut them a little slack. They realize that this is an issue, they're working on it, but they're not quite there yet.
Yeah, interesting. That's great advice. Great advice. To wrap up, since these are short conversations, we could probably talk for a long time about this issue, because there's a lot of organizations that need help in this area. What's one last thing that has captured your attention or imagination, or kind of made you think this week?
I think we are so fixated on what to do now and the pressures of the moment, that we don't allow ourselves or our employees to step back and have time to reflect. And to me, reflection is one of the most critical tools in a leader's quiver. It's the basis of emotional intelligence. be able to reflect and to be self-aware. And we can ask that of our teams as well as of ourselves, but we can't do that if we're pressuring them for what's next, or be on a Zoom call, for 8 hours straight, or 8 Zoom calls that are an hour long the whole day. It's just completely draining. There's a reason we were called Ford Meeting Company when I was at Ford. It was just, that's what you did. That was the culture. And you didn't have a lot of time for desk work. So if you can carve out time for yourself and for your teams to have quiet time, whether it's to take a walk, whether it's to read something that has nothing to do with your industry, or simply watch something fun on Netflix, allow yourself to recharge and to re-tackle this problem once you've had a chance to reflect on it.
That's a great wrap up, because it's one of the reasons I have these conversations. Is it's my time to get perspective from people who are seeing a different lens on the problem that I'm also chewing on. And the other thing, and we've had a little bit of this conversation online, but I had this conversation with a doctor of psychology on engagement that scales this spring, and she was talking about how much certainty is important for calm. And when the environment is uncertain, you can't focus on the next thing because you don't know what it is. And so you have to find certainty internally, like what's your North Star? Because then that allows you to make rapid decisions as things come at you. And so I think that reflection pairs really well with that. So thank you for that advice. And I'm going to close things out because we're already over time, but I really appreciate you joining me. And I'll see you on the Twitter probably.
I'll see you on the internet.
Thank you, Scott.